Well, really glad to be here with all of you, and I just want to echo what Nancy said earlier. It's wonderful to be here with so many partners and friends who've been part of this work in foreign policy and thinking through what a progressive foreign policy is and continuing to do that work. And really privileged to have 3 members of Congress who are very much a part of that work as well. I just want to introduce them briefly, and we can go to some opening comments from then and then get to our discussion. So I'll start at the end. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is from Minnesota's 6th or 5th, sorry. Absolutely, I'm sorry. Elected in 2018. Congressman Jason Crow from Colorado's 6th district. Do I have that? Oh, good. And Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal from Washington's 7th district, and also the
Were the numbers intentional?
No, that's just by luck.
You should have said yes.
But I was just talking with Congresswoman Jayapal in the room earlier. I was a voter in her district for 12 years back in the late 90s and early 2000s, which is why she's going to get more time than any of the other members. But no, we want to get right to the discussion. We're again really lucky to have these members with us, not just because of they're all such great voices in their own right, but also because the congressional voting calendar or clock worked in our favor and did not prevent this panel from happening. So as a former staffer on the Hill, I know how that can occasionally happen. So the basic question here is, what are the challenges that you see as a member of Congress that you're facing right now? I think we can all reel off a number of them, whether it's the Gaza war, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's China, whether it's Latin America. But just talk a little bit about how you perceive those challenges, what maybe in your background brought you to some of the views that you feel are important as we address foreign policy, and what are some of the issues that voters in your district are really concerned about? How are they engaging with foreign policy? So Congresswoman Jayapal, please.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Nancy O'Kale and Matt. Thank you both, and to the Center for International Policy. I think this is a really important space that's being created here for talking about progressive foreign policy. In terms of what brought me here, just a quick word on that, because a lot of people don't always know this about my background, but I'm an immigrant from India. I grew up in India, Indonesia, and Singapore, and then I actually spent almost a decade working on international development issues for a international public health organization all around the world. I worked in refugee camps. I lived in villages in India. I lived in refugee camps. And so I come at this from kind of a more traditional, perhaps, development aid background. But here in Congress, as the chair of the Progressive Caucus, we've really been able to engage in what does it look like to really have a progressive foreign policy? What is that foreign policy? What does that foreign policy look like? And what are the components? And so I thought I would raise 3 things today for your consideration. I think, the first is that obviously as progressives, we have long fought against hawkish military-only foreign policy. And I think that continues to be the case, but I think three things that I've been thinking about. One is the role of international multilateral organizations. This is something that the president expended great capital on in his first 2 years, trying to rebuild some of these international organizations. And I think they're very, very important in a world that is increasingly fragmented in terms of power, economic power, political power. And it has been very important to make sure that we're upholding the norms and values in those international organizations. And that is a challenge, and particularly over the last year, I think it's been difficult to make sure that we are both meeting our economic dependencies on powers around the world that have economic powers, but then also living up to our values and our ability to call out human rights and some of the values that America has led on. I do think that the contradictions in American foreign policy, and there are many ways to think about this, but whether it's how we respond on Ukraine and Russia versus how we respond on Israel and Gaza, or whether it's in terms of U.S. policy towards broad-based sanctions in Cuba and Venezuela. I think these are all cases where we undermine the ability to really lead a global coalition if we're consistently out of step with, or not consistently, but in many important cases out of step with where our international allies are and where those international coalitions are. The second point is the role of Congress. I mean, this has been an increasing issue that we have taken on, and it's not just within the Progressive Caucus, but even beyond that, and with our Republican allies on the other side who believe that there should be a role for Congress. And I think you're seeing this over and over again in different ways, certainly on Yemen, certainly on even on the recent strikes in the Middle East. I think the role of Congress, whether you go back to the 2001-2002 AUMFs or whether you look at recent history, it is increasingly difficult for any president of any party to come to Congress and ask us to weigh in. And increasingly, presidents use their executive authority or their perceived executive authority and make arguments for why they don't need to come to us. But Article 3 of the War Powers Act very clearly says that in any situation that is possible, the president must come and consult with Congress. And so here there have been bipartisan efforts to make sure that Congress has a role, but it is an increasing challenge, and particularly in a very partisan environment where it's difficult to even get an appropriations bill through, it becomes very difficult, and it becomes almost an argument that is used by presidents to say, I can't possibly come to Congress because you're dysfunctional. This is the least functional Congress, the least productive Congress in history, with only 27 bills actually signed into law, but over 700 votes that we've cast on pieces of legislation. The third issue I wanted to raise for your consideration is just the relationship between international foreign policy and domestic policy. And there are plenty of places we could talk about this, whether it's COVID and public health, and the need to really recognize that if we don't invest in public health systems around the world, including with things like special drawing rights and money that is not tied to deep, crippling economic effects, or whether it's around climate change or trade or around migration. I am the ranking member on the Immigration Subcommittee, and I can tell you that this discussion that we're having about the border is deeply tied, and the impacts on domestic policy and our constituents everywhere is deeply tied to how we engage in other countries. How do we address the root causes of migration? How do we make sure that our foreign policy is such that we are assisting in the resources and the kind of governance in other countries and the economic conditions that would foster healthy democracies, but healthy countries around the world, so that people don't have to come to the United States. And I think that here we've taken a lot of positions that are trying to address the situation of the border, but you can't address that unless you address our immigration system and our foreign policy system together. So happy to get into that some more as we get into questions, but certainly if you look at temporary protected status or parole for countries around the world, if you look at safe mobility offices, the ability to actually invest in foreign aid resources around the world, these are all things that are going to help with addressing the issue of migration to the United States, along with reforms to our immigration system here domestically. So lots of things for us to talk about, but really appreciate being able to be with you. And as somebody who, grew up in a place where there were people from all over the world that went to my school in Indonesia, and we thought of the world as a very small place. We all learned multiple languages. We saw ourselves as part of a global community, I think one of the big challenges in the United States is that not everybody has had that opportunity to travel, to see how we are connected. And so it's up to us to really frame the conversation in a way that allows people to see themselves as part of a global society, and that our resources, we always have an argument when I have a constituent sometimes who says, we can't be spending, and I come from a very progressive district, as Matt knows, but we can't be spending so much money on international aid. And my first question is always, what % do you think we spend? And why don't we agree that we will spend whatever % you think we should spend? And they say, well, I think we spend 20%. I'm like, great, taken. I'll take it. I'll take that 20%. Because I think people think that we spend a lot more than we actually do. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Congressman.
Thank you, Matt, for having me, and Nancy, and to CIP, and for all of you. And it's just great to be here with Pramila and Ilhan, two very dear and close friends. You know, I come to foreign policy and national security issues through my background in service. You know, I originally enlisted in the National Guard, actually out of high school, to help pay for college. I come from a working class family and didn't have money to pay for college, so I enlisted in the Guard, and then went active duty and served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's the frame through which I view a lot of my work right now, because I saw not only 20 years of misguided military efforts, AUMFs that went astray, the terrible impact of wars on civilians, and how when we overuse military force, how that blows back on us in many ways, as well as being a moral travesty in many examples. And it really focuses my work on that now. You know, from joining with several of my colleagues to found the Protection of Civilians in Conflict Caucus, to helping establish the CHIMRAP at DOD, to help support the CHIRG at State Department, are some of the efforts that I've embarked on. But, you know, Pramila raised the framework that I agree with, and raised a lot of really important issues. And these are the questions that we have to answer right now. And the first question is, can democracies actually deliver? Right? Because people are looking at that around the world, and we're now over a decade into a democratic recession, right? Around 2010 or so, there was a recession of democracies that has continued, and democracies under assault, because people around the world and here at home are asking, well, look at our system. We're not the stellar example of productivity and legislative efficiency right now. And we're failing to deliver in a lot of ways. That's number one. Number two, whether our rhetoric actually matches, our actions actually match our rhetoric, right? We have this narrative about Ukraine, which I support. I support Ukraine, and I support their fight. But of course, our rhetoric around a rules-based international order and protecting civilians stands in stark contrast to what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now. And the world sees those inconsistencies, and it undermines our ability to maintain that order, and it undermines our ability and our credibility to go around the world and say, you know, our morals is what we lead with, right? So that's the second question. And the third is whether we can actually deliver meaningful things to the developing world. And I know you're not supposed to use the term global south, but I think that's what a lot of people still use, because the global south sits here and says, all right, you know, United States and U.S. allies want us to join on Ukraine. But what's going to help us? What's in it for us, right? Because we're dealing with crushing debt. We're dealing with a climate crisis that's catastrophic to our populations. You know, you go to and talk to folks in Brazil and Colombia and other places, what they need is debt relief, and they need real meaningful action on climate justice, right? That's what they need. So it's a real big question of whether or not we can engage and deliver and meet folks where they're at on their terms, and help lead, but in a different way, right? Not stand up and just tell people what to do, but to lead in a more egalitarian way going forward. That's the real question, and I frankly don't know how we answer all of these right now, because we're debating it, and it remains to be seen whether we can go the distance.
Thank you. Congresswoman.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Nancy, and for the Center of International Policy for having us today. It is truly an honor to be with Pramila and Jason. Jason and I were actually classmates. And so it's just such an incredible opportunity. Pramila talked about being in Indonesia. I want to say you guys have to hear her sing in Indonesian. Just incredible voice, and the fact that she still remembers it, I'm jealous of it, because I used to speak Swahili when I was a kid, and I no longer speak Swahili, and I'm starting to lose my Somali, so I'm always jealous of people who are able to maintain languages that they learned along the way. How do I come to this? I think similarly, I was born in Somalia. I am someone who was made a refugee because of civil war. Got to leave my country of Somalia when I was 8 years old and lived in a refugee camp for 4 years in neighboring Kenya, and got the golden ticket to come to the United States when I was 12 years old. And so I've always really cared about the international community, cared about the ways in which our country's foreign policy impacts the world, and ways in which we can bring it aligned with our values. I think oftentimes when people think about progressives and foreign policy, they oftentimes know what we are against. And we don't really get too many opportunities to talk about what we are for. Oftentimes we're given a choice to vote yes or no on a policy, and in regards to foreign policy, we're always reacting to something that is happening around the world, or actions that are being taken by the administration. Oftentimes our role as members of Congress is not honored or recognized, and I think to have a yes or no on a complicated, nuanced policies oftentimes loses, I think, its meaning, and has us on the record voting yes or no on something that we would like to say more on. And we do that in statements, but between those, I have tried to introduce legislation to try to make sure that people understand what my no's are for and what my yeses are for. So the two areas I often focus is the ways in which we can try to address human rights violations around the world, and have the hypocrisy that oftentimes is presented with the way in which we interact with our allies and our adversaries, to be more understood and aligned with the values that we carry. So I have legislation to stop arming human rights violators, so that there is an actual policy in place that is easy to access. Another area that I work deeply in or care deeply about is sanctions, and the broad-based sanctions that we oftentimes like to utilize, whether it is in Congress or by the administration, and have legislation to actually bring congressional oversight in regards to some of the sanctions that are out there that I think are crippling. One thing that for me that people don't know is that I often talk about my first interaction with America in the refugee camp being through USAID. And that sort of changes, I think, the way in which, as somebody in another country, that you look at the United States when that is your first interaction. I also remember my dad talking about in the 60s that America was known to be in countries through the Peace Corps. And so there was a favorable interaction that people would have. Nowadays, most people are interacting with the United States through drones, through weapons that are made in the US, that are in the hands of dictators, police, or their military, or they're interacting with us in regards to sanctions that are making it hard for them to have necessary medication and food. And so, and that I think creates a national security problem for us. And so I think if we are to care about our national security, if we are to care about the ways in which the world interacts with us, we have to change course. And we have to try to be a country that doesn't just utilize rhetoric, but actually carries out its values by actions.
Thank you. If I could just stay with you for a minute, I just want to talk for a minute about how, one of my formative experiences in foreign policy was when I was a kid. My family moved to the Philippines when my mom and dad volunteered in a refugee camp. And I couldn't understand it at the time, but I came to understand it later, that this was in the early 1980s, almost a decade after the end of the Vietnam War, yet we were still dealing with the long tail of the Vietnam War. The impact of this U.S. policy was still very much, a reality in that part of the world. And I wanted to just give you an opportunity to talk about some of your work in the Africa Policy Working Group, because this is obviously a hugely important region of the world, often overlooked in our debates in Washington. It's a very young region of the world. It's already starting to play a much bigger role in setting the global agenda. And what do we need to really understand about some of the changes? And we talk about Africa as a huge continent, which is a very diverse set of regions. So it's a big question.
Yeah, Africa's not a country, it's a continent.
Quite right.
I always hear people say, like, can you speak African? Maybe. No, I mean, I spent 4 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I sat on the Africa Subcommittee. And in those 4 years, I noticed that we rarely had anyone, the human beings from the continent who were impacted positively or negatively in regards to our policies come testify, so that members could actually hear if certain policies were working or if they were not, and change course. And so when I started to think about how do we change that, we started to work on creating the Africa Policy Working Group. And so far, we've had people, for example, we've had a hearing on Sudan, and we've had victims of the slaughter come to testify. We've had really difficult conversations with the ambassadors, with the administrator, with neighboring ambassadors, and we get to have a robust conversation where we could actually create a normal analysis on the way forward for that particular country. And I think that, oftentimes when people think about Africa, one, they think of it as one place. When they think about Africa, they think only about its deficits. When they think about Africa, they are unable to see the human faces, and they're unable to understand that there is complexities and nuances, and there is diversity, and there's richness, and there's opportunities, as well as the challenges. And so we are not then able to be an actual partner in creating the kind of policies that could uplift the continent. One area that we are focused on in our office with some colleagues is try to look back on some of the sanctions that are still on there, that were put on because of former dictators that are no longer alive or in office. And those sanctions are still impacting those countries, even though most of those sanctions never really changed anything in the particular countries that we have on there. And then also thinking about, it's the fastest growing continent. It's the youngest continent. And so there's a lot of richness with its youth and the opportunities that exist. And so trying to think about policies in that regard. And we were pleased. We pushed the administration to create the Africa Summit, and we were pleased that that happened, and that there are tangible things that are coming out of that, although slowly, not as fast as myself or Chairman Gregory Meeks would like. But I think having Africa not be in the back burner, but be prioritized has always been a priority of mine, and I think we're getting closer to that.
Thank you. Congresswoman Jayapal, from your perspective as serving on the Immigration Subcommittee, I mean, it seems to me that immigration is one of those big ways that we talk about foreign policy without saying that we're talking about foreign policy. I mean, it's so wrapped up in that, and yet obviously a hugely politically explosive issue, as we're learning once again over these past few days. But what's the way through this? Could you please solve immigration for us right now?
I could and I would if you would make me queen for the day and get rid of the filibuster in the Senate. I actually think this is not a hard issue. It has been made a politically tough issue, and that's been true for as long as I've been working on it, and I worked on it for 2 decades before. I guess I should have said that about myself. I started the largest immigrant advocacy organization in Washington State, one of the largest in the country. It's why we have some of the best policies in Washington State around immigration. I know the issue like the back of my hand. And we have known for a long time what the problem is. The problem is we have an immigration system that still uses the same visa caps, the same quotas, the same numbers from 30 years ago to admit people to the United States in a legal pathway. So it's absurd to say that we have a functioning legal system. We don't. We all want one. Americans don't, despite all of the xenophobia and the racism and the hatred that's been directed at immigrants by Donald Trump, by others before, but certainly by Donald Trump at a new level, and then now by the MAGA extremists in the Republican Party, the Americans' view of immigration is actually largely still holding up. What people want is a functioning legal system. And right now, we have 8 million people that are in the family-based backlog. That means I came to this country when I was 16 years old by myself. And it took me 17 years and an alphabet soup of visas to ultimately become a U.S. citizen. I think I'm probably the only member of Congress that's ever been on an H-1B visa. And I knew how to navigate the system, but it was very, very difficult. And so when you have 8 million, and by the time I got my citizenship, it was really too late to bring my parents here because they had to make a choice of either going back to India from Indonesia or trying to stay outside so they could eventually come to the United States, and they chose to go back to India. So I've never lived on the same continent as my parents. And for so many families, you just want your family to be here, and we have this category of family visas, but people can't get in because 8 million people are in the backlog. 2 million people are in the backlog for the employment system. So we have people who are sponsored, they have jobs, they want to come here and work, but we have visa caps that block that. Now, how does that relate to our foreign policy? Well, migration is a product of many things, including American foreign policy. When we go in with broad-based sanctions, when we restrict economic aid by, tying it to crippling conditions that countries have to deal with, their economies collapse. Dictators are allowed to be, in power, and the country is not sustainable either from a political perspective, literally people are being persecuted and killed, from a war perspective, or from an economic perspective. And so people come to the United States. By the way, we have a big banner up for the United States saying, we are the greatest country in the world. Please come here. We do, because the United States is seen around the world as a place that you can have opportunity and that you can be able to live with humanity and respect. And I think that is an important value for us. But I think that if you don't understand that U.S. foreign policy drives migration, and if you don't understand that illegal migration, undocumented immigration to this country has an inverse relationship to legal pathways that exist, then you're missing the whole picture. You can't solve the problem at the border with a bunch of enforcement-only strategies. It will not work. Under Donald Trump, he instituted Title 42, expedited removal, mandatory detention, and you know what that led to? A 337% increase in undocumented migration at the southern border. So anyone who thinks that this is the solution is really missing the picture. And for Democrats, I think we have to be clear that the 2 ways we have to respond is call out the Republican hypocrisy, because they'd like to keep this out there, and they've said it now very clearly, as they have been for some time. as an election issue to turn Americans against people who look like me and Ilhan. But I think the other is to mount a full-throated defense of what we know will work. Just reform the immigration statute. That's the bill that was passed in 2013 in the United States Senate with 68 bipartisan votes. I was on the outside at the time. I held my nose because there was a huge component of border security that I didn't like. But in return, we were getting a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants, family reunification, employment-based visas that are upgraded to what we actually need in this country, and respect for immigrants who are working hard for us every single day. And we were willing to take that compromise. John Boehner was the Speaker of the House at the time. He didn't bring it up because the right-wing Republicans at the time said that they would throw him out as Speaker if he did. So it never got a vote. Would have passed on the House floor. But that compromise is what we need. It had stuff we didn't like. We're willing to do stuff we don't like, but not if it doesn't solve the problem. And so that's really what it comes down to, and I think there's still a pathway there. We've spent more on border security since 2013 than was in the immigration reform bill of 2013. And we've seen no improvement in anything because we haven't fundamentally shifted the system. So we have to think about how do we invest in other countries. Our foreign policy is directly tied to this. What Ilhan said is powerful. People see aid as an important part of what the United States is doing. And so we have to make sure that we're putting good investments in. We have to make sure we're supporting countries to be able to have functioning forms of government, whether or not it's a democracy. As Jason said, I think there is a question there about whether or not democracy is the right form of government everywhere. For a lot of countries, they're looking at the United States and having that question in their mind. But we have to think about these two things as being directly related. And climate change is driving migration. So that's the other major issue that we're going to have to look at if we want to solve the immigration problem.
Thank you. Congressman, just a last question, and maybe we'll have time for one or two questions from the audience. But a word I keep hearing in discussions and kind of big thing foreign policy discussions is interregnum. We're in this moment now where the old foreign policy consensus has broken up clearly, both in the country but also in the parties. The Washington consensus, the neoliberal consensus, and again, this is an area where I really think the administration deserves some credit, just acknowledging and trying to define a new global economic order. I think the details of that order are still to be determined, and that's part of the urgency of this moment. But as you think about that, I mean, what should be the defining features of, I think, a productive and progressive American foreign policy that advances our safety and our prosperity without doing so at the expense of other communities?
There's no doubt that we're at a moment of significant shift in foreign policy and doctrine and theory, which I actually think is a great opportunity, as a matter of fact. Because I'd look back and say, certainly during my lifetime, I think our foreign policy has not delivered for us, hasn't delivered for a lot of the rest of the world. So I think the fact that we are opening up the aperture and looking at this fresh is a great opportunity for all of us. So number one, there is this growing isolationism within our politics, which is not going to turn out well for us or the world. And it's a reflection of the broken American dream, right? People across the country, including a lot of people that I grew up with in the upper Midwest, look around and they say, the American dream is broken for me. Upward mobility is broken. It's out of reach. And the life that my parents and grandparents had is not going to be the life that I will have and my kids will have. So that's driving some of the vitriol in our politics. It's driving the frustration, and it's having a tremendous impact on our ability to make a case for positive engagement with the world and foreign aid spending and these other investments that are really important for us and for the world. That's number one. Number two, AUMFs that have gone awry, right? We just spent 20 years, $3.5 trillion, over 6,000 American lives, hundreds of thousands of other lives. And we don't really have a lot of things to show for it, right? So it's time for Congress to step in and to pull these back and to reignite a national conversation about how we use our military and what's in our interests and what's in the American people's interests. That's number two. And then number three, a people-centered national security. You know, the 20th century model was a model of state-to-state engagement largely. Right? Nation states would engage with other nation states. That is changing and should change. Right? What I would like to see is a people-centered security where the United States can actually engage with the people of a nation and help empower them, help them pursue freedom and dignity on their terms, not necessarily our terms. And I think that would drastically change the way in which we approach our aid spending, our military spending. And then I will throw the fourth in, and that is recalculating the proportion of our spending, right? There's that saying that, you know, you shouldn't tell people what your values are. You show them your budget, and that will tell you what your values are. Right? And the fact that in 2021, and I've served on the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee, and the Foreign Affairs Committee, so I've seen across the entire spectrum of our national security and foreign policy apparatus. And in 2021, the inflationary correction for the defense budget was more than the entire State Department budget, right? Just the plus up to account for inflation. I'm gonna say this again. Just the inflationary correction of the defense budget exceeded our State Department budget. Now, how crazy is that, right? If we're really gonna actually pursue democracy, dignity of all people, in a true people-centered security, we have to drastically reshape the way in which we're allocating our resources so that we can bring to bear the right proportion of diplomatic, humanitarian, cultural, economic, and military to the table. Because right now, we've built all these hammers, so we walk around and every problem is a nail. And it's reflected in our actions.
Thank you. I want to be respectful of your time. You've been so generous. This was such a rich discussion. Please join me in thanking these members. All right. So, no, I would have liked to get to questions,